Hello and welcome to this week's episode of the Science or Fiction podcast, where we interview researchers to separate the science from the fiction in news headlines. I'm your host, Dr. Catherine Bates. I'm a youth development and mental health researcher at King's College London, and this is the Science or Fiction podcast. This week, instead of talking to a researcher or scientist about controversial headline, we're going to find out about how the research gets into the headlines. When news articles cover new research findings, you'll often see a quote from a scientist giving their opinion on the evidence. This journalist has likely gone via the Science Media Centre to find an expert to comment on this story. Communication between journalists and scientists is not always smooth sailing. Sometimes articles can have sensational headlines or can include exaggerated findings, which is part of the motivation for us to make this podcast. And journalists and news outlets aren't always the ones to blame. Journalists are under pressure to write interesting stories and catch people's attention, but scientists are under pressure to generate evidence and explain complex concepts in an accessible way. So how do scientists and the media communicate? How does research make it into the headlines? Today we're talking to Fiona Fox to find out. Fiona is the CEO of the Science Media Centre and the author of Beyond the Hype, the inside story of science's biggest media controversies, and she's been awarded an OBE for her services to science. So welcome to the podcast, Fiona.
Thank you.
Thanks so much for being here today. So I'm really excited to find out about the Science Media Centre. So let's basically start there. Why did you start the Science Media Centre and what kind of work do you do?
Okay, great. So scroll back. If young people are your audience, they probably weren't born at this stage. But anyway, go back about 25 years and the big stories that were in the headlines were MMR causes autism, GM crops, Frankenstein foods kill, animal rights extremists were dominating the headlines. It was just a time of a lot of media frenzies, and the scientific community on the whole were not engaging very effectively. So it was Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth who dominated the GM debate. It was Andrew Wakefield and his supporters and patient groups who were dominating the MMR debate. So where were the really good scientists? So there was a House of Lords Science and Technology Committee investigating this. This was in 2000. All the scientists that gave evidence blamed the media and said they're undermining public trust in science, and they're not covering science well. But all the journalists, including a lot of really good science journalists, actually blamed the scientists and said the scientists were just not engaging effectively, and they come out when they've got a paper in Nature and do a couple of interviews, but then they go right back to their ivory tower and don't engage with these kind of messy, contentious ongoing stories. So we were a recommendation of that report, and we started in April 2002, and it was me. I got the job to run it. And we sat around, we were given this remit of improving the quality of the science in the news media in order to improve the quality of debate amongst the public. Yeah, exactly.
No mean feat.
I can see by your face that you realise that's quite a job. So we literally, two of us, sat down and thought, how do you do that? How do you improve the quality of science in the news media? The news media didn't ask for this centre to be opened. They didn't give evidence to the committee. They didn't care. So we just had the scientific community's backing for us. And we basically worked out three ways, and I'll just go through those very quickly if that's all right.
Yeah, definitely.
So we run three services for the news media. We have a focus on news, which I can explain later if you want, and we have a focus on the kinds of stories that can be misreported. So it's all about raising the quality of science in the news. How do we do it? The thing that underpins it all is our database. So we have a database of science. 20 years on, we have 3,000 scientists on it, and they're very, very good scientists. So there's a lot of attention into quality. It's not, I'm afraid, young junior scientists. It is PhD and above or postdoc and above. Quite a lot of assistant professors and professors. They have to publish in peer-reviewed journals. They have to work for respected institutes like King's. They have to be acknowledged in their field of being really good quality scientists. So they're on the database and they all get keywords. So we've got ones on antidepressants, on psychedelics, on all range of mental health issues, but also climate change, nuclear power, vaping, you name it, we've got the keywords. So that's our raw material, and then the 3 services are rapid reaction to breaking news, roundup of third-party quotes, which you've already mentioned, and briefings. First one is what it says on the tin. Story breaks. We didn't know it was coming, but the world's media are on it. What are they going to do? Are they going to go to, say it's, I don't know, the nuclear disaster in Fukushima, or Boris Johnson goes to hospital with COVID? You know, these breaking stories that none of us have got any control over. We go to the database and say this is all over the media. Politicians are commenting, commentators, single issue protest groups, mavericks. Where is your voice? You understand this issue. You've studied it for 20 years. You know what the evidence is. We need your measured, accurate, evidence-based voice in the mix of this discussion. They know they're on the database to do that, so they give us comments, and we proactively push out to every news desk in the UK. This is a big story of the day. Here's some 5 or 6 different experts, and they give us short quotes. Either the journalists copy and paste them, or they just see that who's got an interesting view and they call them up and get them into the studio. So that's rapid reaction, and we think by doing that we just increase the number of, or make it easier for the public to access good evidence-based measured science in the midst of these media frenzies. Second issue is the one you referred to, which is third-party comments. So new findings are great, but obviously the quality massively varies. So red wine causes cancer, red wine cures cancer in the BMJ, but is it just an observational study, or is it a study just done in mice, or is it the holy grail of a randomised control trial or a biological study where they actually found the mechanism by which red wine is leading to cancer? Let's hope it doesn't, because I like my red wine. So that is great, because we then go back to that database, a bit more time, because this is all the big journals like Nature, Science, Lancet, BMJ. We've got about 15 big journals that have a media operation, and we see those at the same time. So it's very privileged access. We see which papers are going to be highlighted by those journal press officers, and we can say, right, that one, red wine causes cancer, or cannabis leads to psychosis. We will know which ones will be stories and could be misreported. Get the third-party comment saying, beautifully designed study from our friends in IPPN. However, it's only done in mice, or the exact opposite. This is really, really a significant advance. So you're telling the journalists where to put it in the paper. Sometimes they say, right, I'm not going to cover it because 7 people said this was rubbish and why did the journal publish it? But mostly what it does is guide the journalist to, should this be on the front page because it's a big significant advance, or should it be on page 8 as a nice study but with the caveats, so the quotes are used. And we often say red wine causes cancer, but right underneath, however, leading experts urge the public to treat this with caution because it would need to be reproduced in humans or whatever. So that's number 2. And then thirdly, we run press briefings. We're very unusual. Most people don't run them anymore. But for us, quality is having journalists in the room and having the authors of these very complicated, complex, difficult to understand studies talking to the journalists and saying, we want you to, please don't write that because that would be wrong. Please do write this, and explaining the science. And then these briefings are 1 hour long. The scientists present their findings, their methods, but then there's 40 minutes for the journalist to just really interrogate and ask questions and say, if I wrote this in The Sun tomorrow, would that be accurate? The scientists generally say, absolutely not, you need to say this. Then the journalist says, hold on, I've only got 400 words. You've just said 1,000 words. And it's a negotiation about how it's covered. So that is the SMC.
Brilliant.
Sorry,
wow.
quite long.
No, that's fantastic. It's interesting that there's so many different arms to it. The situations where you can kind of preempt what's going to happen. So if you're doing briefings with journals or doing your own press briefings, how does that, you're still not necessarily controlling the narrative of what's in the media, right? You're just you're providing information, you're trying to understand which ones maybe are going to be picked up by the media and be prepared for that. But you can't necessarily control what a newspaper is going to decide is interesting to run.
100%. And I think that's one thing that scientists really struggle with. It's a free press in this country. It's an independent press. Now, having said that, I often, when I go out and talk to scientists and all these hands go up and people say all the things that could go wrong, and they could be misquoted, or they have been misquoted once, or this story all went wrong. I do think, right, we've been doing this for 20 years, and if everything went wrong, what a miserable crew I still wouldn't be here, I'm sure. Mostly it goes right. And there's lots of things that contribute, but partly because we've got specialist journalists in the UK. So we have science, health and environment journalists. It's their beat to cover these things. They become experts themselves. They like scientists. Somebody was asking the head of news at the BBC, why is it that no science journalists ever get promoted to be top big news editors like you? And she said, because they're happy, because they love their job. They don't apply for promotion because they really love being the health editor. So they get to love the scientists, and mostly they'll come to a briefing here, no matter how controversial, and they'll report what the scientists say. So when we get cross with scientists, when they say the media are just irresponsible and I'm not going to come, we get cross with them, because actually when you come, when you engage, you do influence the way that the media reports it. Now, we've got a colleague out here who can't sleep for 2 nights before she runs briefings because of the things that could go wrong. And of course, that's always the way. But we also really anticipate those. So if you're coming here to do a briefing, we actually do something called duty of care, where we sit round before the briefing, all the press officers with all our years of experience, and say the really nasty questions that could come up. It's probably terrifying for the authors, because mostly none of those questions come up. But to prepare them in advance and talk them through, right, if this came up, how would you answer it? A lot of which is, they'll come to talk about their study, but if there's a political issue in the news at the same time, COVID was a classic example. Every single day they would come to talk about a new dexamethasone. Dexamethasone works in the treatment of COVID. We've proved that through Recovery, a clinical trial, and every person in the room is saying, Boris Johnson yesterday said they're going to close down schools. What do you think of that? My opinion on closure of schools is utterly irrelevant and no better than yours. What I'm here to tell you about is that dexamethasone works. So often the duty of care is helping the authors to avoid getting drawn into answering questions that go beyond the scope of that study. So we look after them. So I don't think we just kind of throw them in front of the journalists and hope it goes well. There are ways of supporting the scientists that ensure that it goes well.
I think there's a few things to comment on there in terms of things going wrong and also potentially things getting personal. I often comment on these things, and I often call the fact that we have this 24-hour news cycle and everything's happening really fast, and it's like shorter articles and catchy headlines is like more common now. And I often comment on that being a bad thing, and maybe that's contributing to potential misleading information or exaggeration. But based on what you're saying, that maybe the fact that we are updating, we're online all the time, maybe there's opportunity to change the rhetoric based on the comments that you get from scientists. So it kind of fits in with not the reactive stuff, but the preemptive stuff. So if something goes wrong, then, or if something comes out not the way that you expected, then you can bring in scientists, get comments on it, and then the stories can change again and the headlines can be updated. Yeah. More easily than before, maybe.
Totally true. And I think there are, it would be hard to say that, many fewer journalists writing many more articles is good. It's very clear that your opinion on that, it is, there's less time for fact checking, there's less time to read the whole scientific paper. Those kind of pressures on news do result in lower quality. What's interesting here is a science media centre we're not pushing our brand name, we're not putting any institutional messages, we're just trying to we are incredibly helpful in that situation. So the journalists can't get out and do original stories. They are forced to do the 3 or 4 stories that all their competitors are doing that day. How do they get the third-party comments? They don't have time. You made the point in your introduction that they will often have phoned us. That's true. but sometimes they don't even have to phone us. We will have seen the paper, anticipated what they're interested in, and sent them, before they've even thought of writing it up, 5 comments from leading scientists, which they can copy and paste. So it's very proactive. But you're totally right that the advantages of that are that you can change things very rapidly. So I haven't done this in the past, but I recently asked for some slides for my usual talks that I give to scientists of where we've corrected headlines or corrected inaccuracies. When I went into that folder, I basically saw about 2 a week for the last. I was absolutely amazed. All my colleagues just email, because these journalists like them, they just email the journalists and say, do you know the headline was a bit wrong? And they'll get it changed. So we've got a lovely slide set now, which I'm going to show more in future.
I think that's good for people to know as well, because like you talk about in your book, there is we have this responsibility as scientists to communicate findings. Completely agree. That's why I have this podcast. But there is the personal side to it. So I wanted to ask about personal attacks. You talked about that there was people writing into your employer at one stage, questioning your suitability because they didn't agree with you. And you also have examples where scientists themselves have got into these big disputes with either journalists or news outlets because of the way their research was covered. So do you think it's possible to do good science communication without it getting personal? Is that a risk that we have to take as part of our job, that we might be up against that?
I think that's really interesting. Certainly in terms of mainstream news media, I would say the vast majority of scientists who we work with can engage in mainstream news without any repercussions, without any attacks on them. And there are people, I can tell you, I don't know, Professor Alan Pacey, who is actually an expert on sperm. He's a fertility professor in Sheffield, has just moved to Manchester. He has been helping the media with fertility queries, very much along the lines of your podcast, so very much along the lines of challenging and helping the journalists to challenge over excitable stories. He's been doing that. He's at the end of a mobile phone, he talks to journalists, and he's never had anything but a happy experience. And that's not unusual. Where it goes wrong is attacks on social media. So the mainstream news media are not what's getting you into trouble. So I think the combination of, if it's a toxic issue, and I'm afraid on mental health, quite a few of the most difficult issues we deal with are in mental health. We've done a lot of work on antidepressants. We're now doing a lot of work on psychedelics. But it does feel like probably authors of a new study on antidepressants at some level, or a new study on MECFS or long COVID, at some level will get grief on social media. Our advice to them on that, and we are working hard on, and we're part of a global network now, there are 7 other SMCs around the world, and our colleagues in Australia are playing a really leading role in that, but we're working with them to get the kind of support to these scientists. But one element of that support is urging them to be resilient because of the price of not engaging. If horrible comments on social media force you out of doing media work with mainstream media, the loser is the public interest. The cost is a less well-informed public and societal debate, with all the implications of that for policy. So I'm really keen that we support them in any way we can, and we're talking to a lot of press officers. It's our view that a university or institute comms team should be really have a policy on this and be supporting their academics and minimising the impact. But I think to now say to any scientist, you will never get grief on social media if you give us a quote on this controversial study, would be the most irresponsible thing. I think the exact opposite. So last week, my colleague ran a study with authors at Warwick, which was on long COVID and exercise. So the authors of this new study, which had looked at a particular kind of very mild, very, very mild group exercise therapy, and shown in an RCT that those who had that, who went along to those guided exercise classes, group classes, had benefited more than those that didn't. So good science, a randomised control trial, there aren't many of those in this area, but those authors, we spent so long with them, preparing them for grief on social media. And exactly as I've described it is exactly how it played out. The journalists came, the media coverage was balanced and measured and lovely, and the horrible stuff was on social media. But because we'd prepared them, they were resilient and they're happy with the outcome. That would be our aim.
I've got a couple of questions that were sent in from listeners. So one is kind of more about the media side of it, and one is more about like the actual science communication itself. So in terms of how we actually communicate scientific findings to the public and make sure that they are clear and accessible. How do you deal with uncertainty in science? So you talk about this a little bit in the book, but science is neither fact nor fiction in its nature. It's about testing ideas and basically figuring out how the world works. But how do you make it clear in science communication that uncertainty doesn't necessarily mean inaccuracy?
Yes. Firstly, what I want to say is that we encourage the scientists to talk about uncertainty all the time. So the reason I say that is because when we were set up, I remember the first couple of years, quite a lot of colleagues who'd been in science communication for years, who I was kind of looking to for advice, had a slightly different idea. And it was mainly around climate change and MMR, which are obviously key issues back then. That was really when the skeptics were at a high. So it was a bit of a war between the skeptics and the climate scientists. And some of the communicators had concluded that scientists were being too open about uncertainty and admitting that their climate models weren't perfect and that there was a range of uncertainty around the models. And these communicators wanted the scientists to stop talking about the uncertainty because it was a gift to the skeptics. I disagree. We disagree at the SMC, and we're now more confident, so we say we disagree. And for some years now, we have been urging scientists to talk about the uncertainties. Do not play down the uncertainties in your study. For, as you said, the uncertainties are the accuracy. What those communicators were talking about was something that we don't like, which is messaging.
Which is very different.
Very different. Governments have to do messaging. We did the messy, ambiguous. Classic example of this was the Sarah Gilbert, Oxford AstraZeneca early findings. They saw them, I think, on a Tuesday night at midnight. They were in the Science Media Centre. Well, it was virtual because it was COVID, but they were on the Zoom on the next morning explaining to the journalists that there were two separate findings, that there was one made it look like 90% efficacy and one made it look like 70%, I think. And the journalists were saying, but we want a clear headline. And they were saying, well, there just isn't one yet. It will become clearer as we assess it more, but you wanted us to come and tell you our findings, and we're telling you, and they're messy and complicated, and we are great fans of that. And actually, I think if your starting point is to be open and honest about the uncertainty, the journalists are brilliant at this. I could show you so many examples of brilliant, complicated messaging around uncertainty by the journalists. So a lot of our briefings are often exactly that, that we've done this model, this is the upper limit is this, and that's absolutely huge, but there's a lot of uncertainty around that. There's uncertainty around what we're about in the middle, and that's usually what comes out in the coverage, maybe not in the headline. So I'm a massive fan of that, of being honest and open about the uncertainty.
I feel like being able to communicate uncertainty really took off in the pandemic, because there was suddenly, you talk about this in your book, how suddenly science was like on the front page for months, and the way that we talked about evidence in the public and talked about research just basically changed dramatically in the space of like a few months. So do you think that, where has that led us to? Has that changed the landscape of science communication? did we kind of get a lot better at communicating uncertainty and understanding that on both sides? Did it make a big difference?
Yes. What I don't know is how long that will last, but yes, I think it was remarkable. There was just, never before has there been a time where the most common guest on every radio and television programme, the most quoted, cited people were scientists. And we had Neil Ferguson on Any Questions and Question Time. We had, Ann Johnson on 5 Live and Woman's Hour. I mean, they were everywhere. And they were very good scientists, and I think, honestly, slightly encouraged by us as well over the years. They were open about the uncertainties. And that's why everyone got it took a while, but everyone in the science community got very concerned at this, we're following the science from the politicians, because they suddenly realised that there is no such thing as the science on there is a scientific consensus on climate, there is a scientific consensus on MMR, but that's built up over many years. This was an unknown virus, and every single aspect of it, there was no consensus. So following the science didn't make any sense. Luckily, I think Sage and our chief scientific advisor and our chief medical officer, they never actually did that. They never felt under pressure to go into the cabinet and give the science. They went in and communicated the uncertainty. It's just that by the time that it was like, if you imagine a revolving door, Chris Whitty and Patrick Vallance go in and have their meeting with Boris before the press conference, tell him that there's no certainty, but their assessment of the evidence on face masks, school closures, social distancing, etc., is around here. And then out that door came Boris saying, we're following the science, as if it was one thing. But I think that got challenged as well. We ran a really interesting briefing with Brian Cox and Venki, who ran the Royal Society at the time. Literally, and again, you would never, in peacetime, no journalist would ever come to a briefing like this. It was just a briefing to say there is no such thing as the science. Generally, there is no such thing as the science, because it's only the science that we've got now. Something may come along next month and overturn everything we previously knew. So yeah, it did. And just to give one example, which I think I give in the book, I to those people who say the media can't cope with difficult messaging, the public can't cope with difficult messaging, we need a single clear message. Do you remember the vaccinating children? So JCVI is the agency in the UK that decides whether a vaccine is safe to give to people. That's it. It's like NICE, but for vaccines rather than drugs. They had a major role in the pandemic, and they had been asked to look at whether we should vaccinate, I think it was teenagers rather than children, but I can't actually remember. But anyway, I mean, adults by this stage were all being vaccinated. So this was the open question. It was taking a while. All the media were obsessed by it. I actually got a heads up from a very good friend of ours, Adam Finn, on the JCVI, that they had decided not to make a clear recommendation, because even though the side effects were small, because the risks to teenagers of getting COVID were also small, then they couldn't come out with their remit is to give a risk-benefit analysis. They couldn't, in all faith, say you must vaccinate children, because the risks didn't fall on the right side of the risk-benefit balance. He told me that. I actually spoke to a journalist that day and said, what if I was to tell you that JCVI said no to vaccinating children, but the government would say, but we're going to do it anyway? And that journalist said to me, I don't believe that'll happen. That can't happen. That's too confusing. It's too awful. Nobody will let that happen. And the journalists won't be able to report it. In fact, that is exactly what happened. JCVI came out and said, we've decided not to recommend vaccination for children along our remit. The 4 CMOs the following day, so Chris Whitty and his fellow chief medical officers, came out and announced that they were recommending vaccination of teenagers on the basis of the fact that children spread COVID. They spread it to their school teachers, they spread it to their parents, they spread it to their grandparents, and they are vulnerable. So on a public health basis, which is not what JCVI look into, they look into an individual risk benefit analysis. the CMOs overruled them. JCVI were happy to be overruled. And I thought the media coverage of that was excellent. So this same journalist who'd said to me, that can't happen, it's too messy, wrote it up beautifully. And that night I went home and watched Channel 5 News or something where they did a vox pop. And I couldn't believe it. These people stopped on the street saying, literally repeating, and we'd done a briefing that day with the scientists as well, literally repeating back what the scientists had said. I thought, this is such a great example of science communication working. Saying, well, my understanding is that the one group that said, because children don't get it so badly, it's probably not worth it, but the CMOs think. So they'd really got it. So yeah, big tick.
So when the media and scientists work together, it can result in like really good, really good science communication.
Yeah, and my message then to people who listen to this podcast and young scientists as well is, don't make too many assumptions. Don't assume that this is too complicated to be understood by either news journalists or the public, because if you do it well, they can cope with uncertainty and messiness. And just to go back, the dangers, I think, of the single public health message or the playing down uncertainty, I think they're much greater. You do need to talk to these journalists about the uncertainties and admit what you know and what you don't know and what you may never know or you don't yet know until we get better models.
Yeah.
And it's you saying that, it's not the skeptics.
I think something that comes out of this, like talking about uncertainty and the way that we communicate that, is that it kind of comes back to the methods, I think, for me. Well, that is what we try to focus on in the podcast. We always take one paper and we do talk about the way that the study was conducted and the analysis and the results. And it's the same as what happened in COVID. Like everyone knew what this R number meant. Everyone suddenly knew how like you can model something, but it's not an exact representation of the world. Like suddenly the public, as soon as you explain a method, the public are empowered with that knowledge.
Oh, it's so nice. Yeah, I like hearing you say that, because I really agree. And that's why science in the headlines is always an opportunity. And again, one of my big bugbears, I don't know if you're going to ask me about that, is the kind of corporate comms people who see science in the headlines as the worst time to engage, because that's when it's a bit of a frenzy and it's high profile and things can go wrong. But what they miss is the opportunity for that, exactly what you say, that the public walking around. We did a briefing, which now it just seems so bizarre, but we did a briefing about the manufacturing of vaccines. Because there was this massive, do you remember the whole thing about Pfizer had to be in a fridge and AstraZeneca didn't, and also how you transport them and how we get them to other countries, and how you phase up a little vaccine that they've worked on in Oxford. How do you manufacture that to mass vaccines that everyone in the UK will have? Sarah Gilbert has written a book called Vaxxers with one of her co-workers, and I can't remember her name, which is awful of me, but that's because she was the person who worked on that vaccine thing, and she did a briefing with us. And the number of questions and the appetite, so the journalists as well as the public, the journalists had never thought about how do we actually scale up a proof of concept vaccine into something. That's why they had to bring AstraZeneca in, because Oxford couldn't have done that. And it was just lovely for a while now that's why I say I don't know how long that will last. Because obviously that kind of public knowledge of uncertainties and whatever was very acute in COVID. It will certainly wane, I think. But I do think that maybe what we can do is keep reminding people that when science, you shouldn't walk away from any opportunity to make those points. And things like, I remember saying it to MMR people 20 years ago, when you're asked, is it safe, say, in science, no self-respecting science would say that a vaccine is 100% safe. However, I would take it and I'd recommend I gave it to my children. There are other things you can say that are reassuring, but that shouldn't be, yes, it is a safe vaccine, because we don't know.
Another listener question that we had this week is, how is science communication regulated? So I think you talk a little bit about this in the book, about how you've created guidelines and things like that as part of the Science Media Centre. But this person basically asked, can journalists print whatever they like? is good science communication dependent on good practice from journalists and scientists, or are there guidelines in place?
Wow, that's really interesting, because I can't remember ever being asked that about science communication, about how it's regulated. So let me put that on one side for a minute and talk about journalism. So journalism is regulated in this country, and it's one of the reasons why I still champion journalism as well as information on social media, because information on social media is a bit of a wild west and anyone can put it out there, and that's probably right and proper, but you need to have something which has principles and rules around it, and journalism still does. So there's still this idea that it's to inform as well as entertain, that it has to be impartial and objective and unbiased. The BBC still has massive rules on impartiality, and while we can all think of masses of examples of where the media don't live up to this, the point is it's still there in the regulation. So the print media is regulated by IPSO, that's the press regulator. So for online news media and print media, so all our newspapers, and then broadcast media is regulated by Ofcom. So there's two separate regulators, but they have there's something called the Code of Practice for journalists, which is all around accuracy. So that's all there, and GB News, for example, is getting in real trouble at the moment with Ofcom because they've got politicians interviewing politicians, and that's against the rules. So there are rules. Now, how is science communication regulated? It isn't. So that's such an interesting question, and leads me to say, I think, there are high standards in research institutes and universities around science communication, but when they go wrong, there is no sanction. There is no sanction. And actually, a really interesting thing is that people like David Spiegelhalter and a couple of psychologists, actually, from Chris Chambers and I can't remember his colleague's name, from Cardiff University, these were all scientists who started to, maybe 10 years ago, started to critique media's coverage of science. And they all started by lambasting the media for misreporting science. And very interestingly, within a year or two of them becoming interested in this area, they turned their sights on press officers, because they discovered that when they found awful science coverage, quite often it could be traced back to an awful press release or an awful paper. So Chris Chambers and his colleague, whose name I forget, which is terrible, but they actually decided to do some research on it, and your listeners can look it up. It's very interesting. They actually looked at stories. They did a very rigorous little trial where they found stories over a certain period, 1 month, looked at the claims and traced those claims back. And they found that, I can't remember the percentage now, but in a significant percentage, the exaggeration in the article could be traced back to the press release. And we use that at the Science Media Centre, as you would imagine, to really promote higher standards of science communication as well, such that, and one of the things that came out of that was our press release labelling system, which are labels put on the top of the press release, which are partly for journalists to see at what stage a study is at. Is it peer reviewed? Is it only preliminary? Is it only in mice, or is it in humans? Or kind of at the very top, it will tell you whether this is, a massive randomised controlled trial that should be near the front of the paper, or preliminary, or a preprint, or whatever. So we're very proud of that labelling system. But another more subtle use of it is that the press officer has to put those labels on. So the press officer then, while they're writing their press release, are thinking, I've got to put these labels on. Is this an observational study? And I'm putting that at the top. So if you say observational study at the top, and then you say red wine causes cancer, clearly that's wrong. So I think it is a little, we call it a nudge. It's a little nudge to the press officers, and especially many brilliant science press officers in universities who will already be doing this, so that's fine. And they've adopted the labelling system because they love it, but not because it forces them to do good quality press releases. I'm not saying that. But I think for new press officers coming into it, that's the little nudge. And also, of course, to the scientists, because the scientists might be sitting there saying to them, this is a fantastic study showing that red wine causes cancer. And the press officer is saying, well, is it? Because it's observational, so it should be linked with or associated with or whatever. So yeah, so there's no regulation, but there's quite a lot of us who care about high standards in science communication.
Yeah, and a lot of scientists that do as well, right? Like more often than not, like the priority is to communicate the findings really clearly. And it sounds like it's like you almost need to start the communication way further back. So you need to communicate well with your press, as a scientist, with the press officer, and then, you know, it snowballs from there. Yeah. So I guess we've kind of mentioned it a few times, but we can't really have a conversation about science and the media without talking about social media. So how does this all fit basically into the changing media landscape and the way that we consume information? So you do say in your book that, like, you comment on social media a little bit to say, like, although, you know, science communication is kind of moving to social media or science news or journalism, it's still by the big news outlets. So you're consuming information in a different way, but it's still, you know, similar journalism. But there is an increasing amount of misleading information out there, and it's not necessarily coming from scientists. Like, kind of everyone can comment and have an opinion now. For example, a recent study reviewed the top 100 TikTok videos on ADHD and found that over 50% were classified as misleading. So how can we adapt to ensure that the science that the public is consuming is accurate?
Yeah. So we think about this all the time, and we don't have firm answers because things are changing in front of our eyes. So you could argue, and people have argued to me, that the SMC is not doing a good job if it's not doing what we do for news media for social media. Partly, we can't do that because we're a small centre with 5 press officers and a limited budget. And one of our favourite board members, Will Moy, who runs Full Fact, who's amazing, once said to us, don't do a little bit of social media badly, Fiona. You do news really well. All of the scientific community, if they want to get their stuff on news, come to the SMC, because news, we do news all day, every day. We know the beast. We know how to manage it. We don't know how to make videos for TikTok. We don't have those skills. A lot of universities do have those skills, and a lot of them are doing it. The Wellcome Trust has got a massive digital media team, and they do a lot of creating content to put out on social media. So one of the answers is we just don't have the capacity. But there's a more sophisticated answer, I think, which is something we're watching. And I'd say 2 things. One, there's a lot of evidence that shows that the news media drives the discussions that are taking place on social media. So if you're affecting and positively impacting the quality of science in the news media, you will be, that will have an impact on social media debates. There's not much that is raging on social media that didn't start from either politics or the news media reporting it. So that's one thing. That's a justification for us to stay in the news media focus. But the second one is, and as a mother of a 24-year-old, is how much information on social media is actually from news media. And because we were interested in this, we've actually done our own Ipsos poll on it, and discovered that when people say, I get my information entirely and exclusively from Twitter and TikTok, it doesn't mean that they're not getting it. So my son, who obviously never talks to me and is always on his phone, will just raise his head at the dinner table and say, oh, I don't know, Djokovic has just lost or won or whatever. And I'll say, how do you know that? Grab his phone, and it's from a BBC News flash. But his mate has shared it with him on Twitter. So they're not going to the BBC for their news, young people. They're not going to The Guardian, but it doesn't mean that their mate who's just told them something hasn't sent them a link to a news media article. So that's one aspect of this. It's slightly exaggerated that this is just people talking to each other, and that is the level of information that people are getting. And the other side of it, finally, is that we've actually got a big project on at the moment where we're going into every newsroom and looking at what they are doing to drive their content onto social media. So like the rest of us, they realise that this young audience from 15 to 25 has vacated the news media and gets its information about science or anything from social media. They may come back in future. We don't know actually whether they'll come back, but there is a possibility that they will never look at a news site in their life. So now the news media, to survive, but also I think for democracy and, you know, well-informed societies, are thinking, how do we get good, objective, accurate, regulated news journalism to the audience, to this younger audience?
I think we just also need to just keep prioritizing like long form content. Like, people want the information and they want the details. So if maybe it's about sticking with that, and then also having, like you say, the short videos and the things that are going to put information in front of people. But I think there should always be an opportunity to be able to go and listen to a half-an-hour podcast like ours about that news article, or be able to read an article about it as well.
Yeah, and I think, you know, there's lovely, the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism is very good at this. They're a non-teaching, they're just a research institute in Oxford, and they're great. And they showed that at high points of the pandemic, in their thousands, people came back to news media. And it's really interesting to look at the spikes, because they then got fed up and went back onto social media. The whole podcast thing is relatively new and absolutely amazing. I mean, big audiences for podcasts. People, it shows the appetite.
Yeah. I think making the point that podcasts are really great is a good place to end. So thank you so much for coming on today. Like, I've learned so much about just how science communicates with the media, and it's really interesting to hear where you're going next with like finding out what the newsrooms are doing to push out their information as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to Fiona for joining us on the podcast today, and thank you all for listening. You can follow us for updates and more information on Instagram at Science or Fiction Podcast, and TikTok as well, and on X or Twitter at Sci or Fiction Pod. If you want to get in touch or you have a suggestion for a future topic, you can email us at info@scienceorfiction.co.uk or DM us on social media. And as always, you can find recommendations and link to support at scienceorfiction.co.uk. Thank you to the Young Person Advisory Groups for their input on this series, and thank you to Kit Studio for the branding and Jamie Johnson for the music. See you next time.